Can knowledge graphs be the solution for Nazi-looted art? I'm Laurel Zuckerman. Thank you for joining the session. The Error is the Message, Extracting Insights from Deceptive Data for Nazi-Looted Art. As many of you know, the Nazis looted about a fifth of the art treasures in Europe during the period where Hitler was in power. And they particularly targeted Jewish people, and looting of and persecution of Jews started in Germany in 1933, and looting of all of their property was an integral part of the Holocaust. A lot of the artworks that were lost during that time have still not been recovered. Knowledge graphs, with their capacity for surfacing vast hidden networks, can help detect looted art from the ownership history or provenance of the artworks. Last year, I presented a study on how one can use Wikidata and the amazing knowledge graph that it has with deep relations in order to track looted art. However, there was a problem, and that was that so much of the provenance information about these artworks is false. That's what we're going to look at today, the false provenances and how to deal with them. What is a provenance error? Provenance is generally considered to be the ownership history of an artwork, and an error is simply a deviation from accuracy or correctness. To illustrate this, I'm going to take an example from my own family, Picasso, that my great-granduncle owned in Germany before Hitler came to power. Now, what you see in the background is a close-up of the painting, and what you see in blue in the circles are the years when someone wrote something about the ownership history of this painting. Some of these stories are true. You see the sources there. And some of these stories in orange are false. And when you line them up chronologically, what you see is a clear inflection point where stories that had been true are now all false. And if you zoom in on the false stories that are told, that's what you see in the upper bubbles. You see that these stories are different. It's not one false story. Over time, it's different false stories that change. And if you look down at the names that are in yellow, you see that the names of the people telling these different false stories are also different. Now, these false versions were eventually debunked by the discovery of archival documents in a period of research that took about 12 years. However, the authors of these false provenances are cited as authorities in many, many other artworks. Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon occurrence when it comes to Holocaust-linked art. Here are a few names of other Jewish collectors whose artworks also had false provenances. You might recognize some of these paintings, like, for example, the famous woman in gold. They all had provenance errors. To illustrate a few, here's a Pissarro where the owner's name, Lili Cassira, was omitted from the provenance text, and there was an erroneous title and errors in the name of the gallery, errors in the name of the owner, errors in the name of the place where the transfers occurred. This El Greco was owned by Julius Priester, but his name was also omitted from the provenance text. A fake name was added to the provenance text. The real events were erased, and the author of the provenance text even gave himself a fake name to author the provenance text. One sees many different kinds of errors with many different artworks. Serena Lederer, for example, owned this Klimt painting. Her name was omitted from the provenance text, a wrong name was inserted, and Austria restituted this painting to the wrong family because of the incorrect provenance. Common errors in Holocaust-linked art can actually be listed and classified. Typically, the owner's name is omitted, and there are erroneous dates, places, events, misspellings, mistranscription, data errors. Those are just a few of the errors that one commonly sees. So to recap, we're in a situation today in 2023 where we have false or incomplete information on a massive scale. And we also have a confusion between provenance with the definition that I gave you as an ownership history that is real events, and provenance as stories that someone tells about the ownership history at a particular point in time. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if trusted authorities like art historians and museums are publishing erroneous provenances, one has to wonder, what is a reliable source for what we're reading? We have another problem with the principle of errors and cleaning errors in order to prepare data for digitization, making it machine readable, semantically enriched, etc. We lose information that's absolutely key, and we risk conferring a kind of legitimacy on incomplete and erroneous information that's linked to the Holocaust. Errors are an obstacle to identifying Holocaust-linked art, but the solution is not to erase them or to erase the data that's connected with them. The solution is to focus on these errors, flag them, and track them. We can use errors as information, as clues. And in this next section, I'm going to talk about how we can do this and how we can organize the data to do this. So here are some ways that we can use errors. For example, we can track those fake names that were inserted. We identify the names in the provenances. So if we go back to those statements that were false, we can isolate for the names. And then search the graph for all the occurrences where those names appear and all of the connections that there are to those names. We can also flag unreliable publications. Right now, if there's a false provenance in a publication, people don't know that and they assume that it's good. So where are these false provenances published? In letters, in exhibition catalogs, in magazine articles, in books, biographies, museum documents, auction catalogs, catalogue raisonné, dealer records. All of those can be flagged. And we'll talk later about how we can link that in to the interlinked knowledge graphs. Another way we can go is to play detective and look at the author's MO. How is the error introduced? For example, one author replaces the real name of the collector with the name of a famous art dealer who really existed, but who had nothing to do with the painting. Another systematically simply omits the Jewish collectors. Another changes the sales date to a date before the Nazi era, so it doesn't set off any red flags. So there's any number of MOs that one might be able to identify, and which would be very interesting to check the patterns to identify what else has the same kind of trouble. So you're probably wondering how we know it's an error. How do we know that it's not just a scholarly debate or a difference of opinion? These errors, they're debunked, just like fake news. And they're debunked in particular places, in restitution cases, in after a restitution of an artwork. Often artworks are auctioned off, and the sales catalogs then have the corrected provenance with the information that it was restituted. So one knows that all the previous provenances were erroneous. You have national committees that have restitution documents, and you have a site that aggregates all the information about looted art called lootedart.com. And there you'll see a lot of information about erroneous provenances. There are books and scholarly articles as well. So we have places where errors are debunked. Now, this is a Wikidata query, which shows sources that have talked about false provenances. And one of the things that's interesting here is that it's not just Nazi looted art. It's also looted antiquities and forgeries. And when we start to look at how the information can be organized, we see that we have a pattern that fits all of them. That is, you have the artwork, which is the subject of a provenance. That provenance contains an error. That error and the provenance are both the subject of other documents, a book, an auction catalog, a commission report, a news article, etc. So we see the start of a structure that we can use here for the debunking. Now, we have similar errors in forgeries and looted antiquities, and that's interesting because the art world is actually a very, very small world. And so you might have the same dealer, in this case, Frederick Mont, who is selling with a false provenance art that turns out to be a forgery, and different art that turns out to be Nazi loot. And this same Frederick Mont is also himself the subject of a data error in one of the authority files. Now, on the left, you see a Wikidata query with the Frederick Mont together with the other dealers who were the subject of the same data error. And on the right, you see a data visualization by Ontotext Metafactory using Wikidata, which shows the links. And we can start to bring together all of these different errors and count them. And the number of errors attached to someone can also be an indicator. Now, where do we flag the errors? On the right, we have the metadata about a provenance publication, and we can flag it at that level with the publisher, the author, the financier, the date of publication. On the left, we have the provenance text with the series of statements, any one of which can be erroneous. So we can flag specific claims which happen to be false. For example, wrong date, wrong place, wrong seller, wrong buyer, wrong transaction, wrong story, name misspelled, etc. So we can work at the metadata level or at the detailed level. Now, why hasn't this been done yet? Well, one of the reasons is that the ontology that's most used in the art world, CIDOC-CRM, and the ontologies specifically derived for the art world, linked art, they conceive provenance as a series of events, and the implicit idea is that these events are real. It's simply not designed to track multiple stories or false stories. So I think we need to build bridges to an ontology that can represent and track errors in order to analyze patterns of false provenances and the networks of relations that underlie them. Now, Wikidata plays a key role because it provides identifiers that can bridge data silos. What you see here with same as statements is a selection of external identifiers which are in Wikidata, which point to data sets outside of Wikidata that are relevant for the domain of Nazi looted art. Wikidata also provides valuable context. On the right, you see a graph where you have names that are flagged because in Wikidata, you have the information that tells you that that's a Nazi party member or it's an art looting red flag name. You also have the information about whether someone's a Jewish refugee or a Holocaust victim, a trustee or president of a museum, part of an art dealing dynasty, who the business partners are. You can eventually find other artworks that are subject in the same publication, and you can find links to criminal investigations or civil lawsuits. And when that information isn't in Wikidata, you have identifiers that point to places where the information does exist. So we can move very quickly from simply data to knowledge using this tremendous context that we've got in Wikidata. So which ontologies for tracking provenance errors? There are quite a few that could offer us some kind of benefit, but I'm going to focus on two. And the first one is crime investigation. And crime investigation ontologies are interesting in part because you have an adversarial relationship where there's an attempt to uncover the truth with the idea of evidence and a crime scene and witnesses and investigators. And that can be very useful. And in fact, for looted antiquities, it's a perfect fit. The next one is disinformation networks. And this is a drawing that is very recent, presented by Ontotext this year by Anaya Georgieva. And this schema is very, I think, relevant for what we're doing. You have a concept about which a claim is made. That claim is debunked in a review, and this debunking is supported by evidence. So what does that look like in our case here, if we apply it to the art world? We have an artwork that's the subject of some kind of publication, for example, an art catalog. That publication contains a provenance. That publication is the subject of a review, which is provenance contains error, and there is evidence for that in a debunker publication. If we take the instance that is the Klimt painting that Austria returned to the wrong family, we see the Klimt painting is the subject of the art catalog. The art catalog contained a provenance that contained a false statement. That information was debunked in this case, a news article, which gives evidence for the review. Provenance contains error. So we have a fairly solid way, I think, to look at the information. Now, who are our users? We have two very different types of users. We have power users of federated SPARQL queries, people who might be using machine learning and AI who want to analyze the data and identify other artworks, predict other artworks that might have false provenances. And we have end users who just want to look at art and aren't interested in tech, but it might be useful for them to know that something is false in what they're looking at. So error tracking and display should take into account the needs of both of these types of users. So we're looking at a practical approach here. We want to avoid the replication of data and leverage data pipelines that already work. So for example, on the right, you see Goodreads and WorldCat already are integrated. WorldCat and Wikidata already trade identifiers. And between Wikidata and collection management systems, which are used for most of the museums in the United States and Europe, you have very commonly used external identifiers, which are ULAN, and the German National Library identifiers. So all of these things already exist without us doing anything. So we want to be able to identify the key points of entry into these interlinked knowledge graphs. And for the, let's say, more sophisticated users, we want to encourage experiments in pattern detection. So how could we enter the knowledge graph via WorldCat? What is WorldCat? It's a gigantic database of books and libraries, and it integrates with libraries and with Goodreads reviews. It has identifiers in Wikidata, and it has 70 million visitors per year. So how could we get into this information to WorldCat? WorldCat has a feature which is a list. For example, you can create a list of unreliable art history and drop the books into it. It even has a feature which is annotations, so you can explain why it's in the list. So you have already structures that pre-exist that could be exploited. Another way to go would be to see if you could get museums to display in their online catalogs contextual information which already exists, for example, in Wikidata or eventually in WorldCat. For example, you could have references that contain false information display in red. So some observations. We've got an epidemic of provenance errors of artworks owned by Jews plundered in the Holocaust today in 2023. We don't want to clean away the errors. That loses information. We want to focus on the errors, track them, identify the patterns, and use these errors to identify other artworks with errors. Always asking that same question. What else? What else is similar? What is the pattern? What can these errors help us to predict? This could be, for those interested, an excellent challenge for people using machine learning, recommender systems, predictor systems, and AI. And with this recent chat GPT, it just became a whole lot easier to analyze masses of text. If you're interested in the Wikidata study, it's in the slide. You can check it out. There's also a video. So I would just like to thank you for listening to this talk, and I would be very happy to answer any